second week of trying this new timing, and maybe you saw that some of us came in a little bit later after worship had started, so we're still working out the kinks. It's a great joy to welcome the Reverend Dr. Newell Williams and the Reverend Sue Mcdougall, who's here as well. We are thankful. I want to tell you, I don't know that I can embarrass Newell with a lot of different stories, but everything I know about music, I learned from his parents, because his mother taught the cherub and the little choirs at my home church, and his father was the director for the youth and for the adults. And they were marvelous people, and they've raised a marvelous son. And some of us are older and wiser than others, but I won't get into that. But literally, Newell has written the book on Christian history, history of Christianity in the U.S., and then also disciples' history. It's a joy that you're here, Newell. I'm so grateful. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be in the presence of someone who is the age of my younger brother. And I do have to say that I am the president of Bright Divinity School, but nothing would happen at Bright without Kathleen Winter. You're not surprised, are you? Yeah. We are so grateful, those of us on the faculty and staff, to have such a colleague as we have in her. I know that lunchtime is coming, right? We learned about people who are without food this morning, and so one wouldn't want to make light of this. We cannot live by bread alone, but soon you will be hungry. So I am going to attempt to describe the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in one sentence. This is the sentence. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the United States and Canada is a North American mainstream moderate denomination of Reformed heritage. You got that right? It probably needs to be exegeted, and that's my plan. I want to talk about each one of these phrases, and it's probably going to take about 30 minutes. And then I hope we can have some conversation. That's the plan. Let's begin with the phrase reformed heritage. What does that mean? I think of the Christian church as a whole as a plant that has grown up out of first century Judaism. This church divided into Eastern Orthodoxy and Western Catholicism in the 11th century. In the 16th century, Western Catholicism divided into several reforming traditions. And you know some of these names well. Lutheran, Reformed, Radical. Catholics had a Reformation in that same era, and Anglican. The roots of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ are in the Reformed tradition. Now, the Reformed tradition is associated with Ulrich Zwingli in Zurich, John Calvin in Geneva, the Reformed churches of Germany and the Netherlands, the Presbyterians of Scotland, and English Puritans. The spiritual roots of the founders of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, in such leaders as Barton W. Stone, Thomas, and Alexander Campbell, can be traced to Scottish Presbyterianism and English Puritans. Now, this Reformed tradition emphasizes that God is about grace. God is about love. Grace, God's love for the world. Those are big terms in the Reformed tradition. But there's also another side, and it's the side that has been a problem from the very beginning of the Reformed tradition. there has been a tremendous emphasis upon right belief, so that many people in this country want to know, what are your church's beliefs? That's a Reformed church notion, that the beliefs are really, really important, and you've got to get them right. And the other thing that's equal to beliefs is church order. So you have Presbyterians, governance in the church by presbyters. You have Congregationalists, churches run by the congregation. Baptists are in this tradition. Oh my gosh, right? All this squabbling about, what do you believe? How do you organize your church? And that is where the movement led by Stone and the Campbells begins. Believing that God wills the unity of the church, Barton W. Stone, fifth generation American, and Thomas and Alexander Campbell, immigrants from Northern Ireland, decried the divisions they had experienced in their early 19th century Presbyterian churches. Having observed creeds and confessions used to divide the church, they refused to accept as terms of fellowship statements of belief other than the simple confession that Jesus is the Christ. Believing that what they viewed as the apostolic institutions or practices of believers' immersion for the assurance of the forgiveness of sins, and every Lord's Day celebration of the Lord's Supper for the spiritual upbuilding of believers. That's about it, right? There are practices and there is a simple confession. And that they hoped and prayed and worked would make for unity within the whole church. For Stone and the Campbells, however, Christianity and Christian unity was always about more than mere religion, more than simple reunion of organizations. It pointed to the very nature of the church, which is, in the words of Thomas Campbell, essentially, intentionally, and constitutionally one. The unity of the church was the evidence by which the world would believe that the Father sent the Son, and therefore the means by which God would ultimately usher in a reign of peace and justice on this earth. Stone and Thomas Campbell advocated using the simple term Christian to identify the church, eschewing all distinctive names such as Presbyterian, Baptist, Methodist, for the name given in the book of Acts for the church. Alexander Campbell preferred what he called a more humble name, disciples. Disciples, are learners. Learners of Christ, a term widely used in the Gospels to identify what he saw as a distinctive movement for a restoration and unity of the church. The Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, along with the churches of Christ and the Christian churches and churches of Christ in North America are all springs from this beginning with Stone and the Campbells. And this suggests, I think, how difficult Christian unity is. This Christian unity movement itself has divided over such issues as, guess what? What do you believe and what do you do and how do you do it? These are the source of these divisions. But the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, is not only a denomination of the Reformed heritage. It is a North American denomination. North America has long been racially and culturally diverse. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ participates in the racial and cultural diversity of North America, including in its membership European Americans, African Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans as well. It has also, we must confess, participated in the white racism and the privileging of Anglo culture in its past, and we must, I think, be aware of the fact even yet, even though we often don't know what we're doing, how it's being heard, how it's being experienced. White racism is a real issue in our country and certainly within the church. Nevertheless, the earliest congregations of the Stone Campbell movement, Barton Stone's Cane Ridge congregation in Bourbon County, Kentucky, and Thomas and Alexander Campbell's Brush Run congregation in western Pennsylvania, they included both European and African American members from the start. In 1917, a general church African American ministry was formed. It's called the National Christian Missionary Convention in its beginnings. This organization was a result of the determination of a most remarkable man, Preston Taylor, a former slave who was minister of the Gay Street Christian Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and a very successful entrepreneur. The purpose of the National Christian Missionary Convention was to empower the witness of black disciples as members of the whole church through a partnership with white disciples that would recognize black leadership in an era of blatant white supremacy and paternalism. At the first meeting of this new organization, addressing a body of both blacks and whites, Taylor declared the following. I think this is one of the finest statements of disciples' practice, theology, that I can find. Written by the former slave. The disciples of Christ, strange as it may seem, need the colored people, if for no other reason as the acid test of Christian orthodoxy and willingness to follow the Christ all the way in the program of human redemption. For if the white brethren can include in their religious theory and practice the colored people as real brothers and sisters, they will have avoided the heresy of heresies. The heresy of heresies. Alexander Campbell was the one who'd said the heresy of heresies is to put anything, any distinction between the unity of the church. And that, this wise man realized, certainly included race. The National Convention continues today as the National Convocation of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. That group and 3 others will be coming to the TCU campus. We hope this coming summer. It was supposed to be 2 summers ago, but we hope that they will meet on the campus of TCU. There are over 400 congregations associated with the National Convention, about 70,000 disciples of Christ, a group that is growing within our disciples' family. Hispanics have been numbered among disciples since the last years of the 19th century. Until recently, however, growth in number of Hispanic disciples has been slow. In 1991, disciples established the Central Pastoral Office for Hispanic Ministries. This Central Pastoral Office for Hispanic Ministries has three objectives: to provide programming and pastoral care to Hispanic leaders and congregations, to advise the different regional and general ministries of the church on Hispanic ministry, and to be an advocate of Hispanic disciples. The national pastor of the Hispanic ministries has an oversight of more than 200 congregations, a membership of close to 9,000, and Hispanics are the fastest growing ethnic group in the Christian church, Disciples of Christ. Late in the 19th century, disciples opened a mission to the Chinese in Portland, Oregon. It was extremely successful. In 1907, another Chinese congregation was established in San Francisco. However, both missions were closed in 1923 due to anti-Asian hostility reflected in the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And isn't it sad that right now attacks upon Asian Americans are on the increase once again? Once again. In 1901, a small group of Asian, or rather Japanese, came into contact with disciples in Southern California. By 1942, there were 9 Japanese Christian churches. However, all 9 were closed with the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. They were a threat, you know. They had to be put in camps. After their detention, former Japanese Christian church members founded West Adams Christian Church in Los Angeles, and it continues to this day. In 1933, Filipino Christian Church was founded in Los Angeles and has had an uninterrupted ministry to this day, though that is the only one of the early Asian plants that can make such a statement. A new wave of immigrants from Asia to the United States began with the Immigration Act of 1965. Who was the President of the United States in 1965? Yes. What church did he belong to? Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. He was almost every Sunday in National City Christian Church. Dramatically changed this country. In 1976, Wilshire Korean Christian Church became the first Korean disciples congregation. In 1978, a consultation on Asian ministries was held in Indianapolis. Out of this consultation emerged the organization known today as North American Pacific Asian Disciples, or NAPAD. Currently, there are more than 100 NAPAD churches, totaling more than 7,000 disciples of Christ. Again, it's a fast-growing group within our church. Approximately 75% of these congregations are Korean. Others are Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, Vietnamese, Indonesian, and Samoan. Another aspect of North American life is the growing role of women in all areas of society. Disciples have participated in this development, beginning early, as in the last quarter of the 19th century. How did this begin? How did it happen? It began with the organization of the Christian Women's Board of Missions and the first ordinations of women to ministry. This phenomena has been the result of the Christian commitment of women who were not to be silenced by the claim that their desire to assume expanded roles in the church was simply an aping of women's rights movements in the larger society. At the 1896, not 1996, at the 1896 Christian Women's Board of Missions Convention, a missionary by the name of Candace Lehman Smith made this, I think, remarkable statement. I am not an advocate of women's rights, popularly so called. I only plead for her the freedom in Christ Jesus to use the rights she has. Let us forget the things that are behind, including the spheres prescribed by us in the days of our ignorance. Let us press forward to the things that are before, making for ourselves a sphere that shall be bound but by the limits of humanity's need and the love of humanity's Redeemer. But there is more. The Christian Church Disciples of Christ is a North American mainstream denomination. Sociologists have defined mainstream religious groups as those that identify with and contribute to the definition of society's core values. Well, given this definition, the designation mainstream does not narrow the description of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ very much, as many American religious groups fall in this category. Greater definition is achieved by modifying mainstream with the term moderate. Mainstream religious groups may be classified along a liberal to moderate to conservative spectrum according to religious, social, and political views. On the left is the Jewish community. That would be the most liberal, the Jewish community. Just to the right of the Jewish community are liberal Protestants. Who are we talking about? Identified in most places, but not necessarily in Texas, as Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and the United Church of Christ. In the center are Catholics and moderate Protestants identified as Methodists, Lutherans, Northern Baptists, the Reformed churches, and the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. To the right of center are black Protestant denominations. To their right are conservative Protestants such as Southern Baptists, Church of Christ, Nazarenes, Assemblies of God, and Churches of God. But I don't suppose I need to tell you, for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ to be classified as moderate does not mean that all disciples hold moderate views on all religious, social, and political issues. Views somewhere between liberal and conservative. On the contrary, in contrast to conservative churches, where most members, or at least most of the leaders, might be assumed to hold the same positions on an issue such as homosexuality, in the moderate churches, as the Methodists are struggling even yet, in the moderate churches, such as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the one-time United Methodists, now dividing over what issue? Homosexuality. My gosh. Bottom line, in a church like ours, you can expect to find at least two or more positions significantly represented in regard to any of the controversial issues of our day, social, political, or religious. In other words, life in moderate churches can be lively. Also heartbreaking as friends disappear because of a difference which should not divide the church. Finally, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is a Reformed North American mainstream moderate denomination. Yes, we are a denomination. Denominations are identified by their testimony, traditions, name, institutions, and relationships. And that would cover most of the churches that say they are non-denominational. They fit the category too. But how do we fit the category? With Christians everywhere, this church, the Disciples of Christ, testifies that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And we proclaim him, like Christians everywhere, as Lord and Savior of the world. This is our confession of faith. And we require no further confession for membership in Christ's church. Our traditions of baptism and the Lord's Supper are equally inclusive. While practicing believers' immersion, most congregations affirm the baptism of other churches. The Lord's table is open to all who follow Christ, and we allow each individual to determine whether they are followers of Christ. Our name combines the family name Christian with the distinctive term Disciples of Christ, which points to our identity not as those who have attained to the fullness of the stature of Christ, but those who are yet learners of Christ. Our institutions are under the authority of Christ, not a human hierarchy. That can be very frustrating to some folk. Yet our free and voluntary relationships as congregations, regions, and general ministries affirm our oneness in Christ. We cooperate, but it is freely. And we don't have to, which is sometimes disappointing. All of these markers by which a denomination is identified point in one direction for we disciples. We have a fundamental commitment to the unity of Christ's church. At the heart of our life as the Christian Church Disciples of Christ is what we identify in the preamble to the design of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ as, quote, God's covenant of love, which binds us to God and to one another. God's covenant of love. Because of God's covenant with us, we are in covenant with one another. In the words of Barton Stone, Christian unity is our polar star. And that polar star has always been about more than a mere ecclesiastical reunion. As Stone and the Campbells affirmed, Christian unity is what it means to be church. It is a means by which the world will believe that the Father sent the Son, and God's reign of peace and justice will be established on this earth. In the words of the identity statement approved by the 2007 Fort Worth General Assembly, which some of you helped to happen in our own neighborhood, we affirm the following statement. We are disciples of Christ, a movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. As part of the one body of Christ, we welcome all to the Lord's table as God has welcomed us. So be it. And we have 14 minutes for conversation.
Newell, can you talk a little bit about what you think about the next few years, decades, about the Christian church, disciples of Christ?
Sure. First of all, I have to say what I often tell my classes in church history. Predictions of the church's growth or decline are not very good. In the year 1800, beginning of the 19th century, only 42% of Americans had any church affiliation at all. And it was widely believed that because of the American Revolution, which had been a secular event, contrary to what people might try to tell you, it was led by deists who had no need for the Bible and no need for church. It was believed that this would be the first major country to see Christianity disappear altogether. That's what people were predicting in the year 1800. Within 35 years, 75% of the population was related to the church, within 35 years. Why? Well, there was a remarkable revival that started at Cane Ridge, led by Barton W. Stone, Disciples founder. There were also revivals of religion in the Northeast, led by members of the Yale University faculty. This nation that was supposed to be devoid of Christianity became one of the most active Christian nations in the world. So it's not good at predicting things. What do you suppose has happened to disciples during the pandemic? We know now. There are two categories in the yearbook. You have membership by membership, right? And then you have something called like active membership, or what's the proper term? It's in the yearbook, but it means that you do something, like you show up in some way. Pardon? Participating, that's it. Or maybe you contribute. This last year during the pandemic, there was an increase in participating members. Want to guess how much? 71,000 more disciples participated this last year than the year before. 71,000 more. Wow. Who would have thought that a pandemic would cause people to participate in the life of their church more than they did before? Who would have imagined? What's ahead? Gosh, I don't know. But I think this statistic is quite important. Maybe it always happens. Maybe when we have a catastrophe, people realize we need God. I don't know. But as a historian, I don't trust efforts to see the future. I I do trust that God is at work. And I'm bold to hope and pray that God is at work in our Disciples of Christ communities. I certainly see evidence of it. I certainly see evidence of it. I'll say one other thing about it, because we only have 15 minutes. That's the first question. This is the first year that the average age of so-called mainstream Protestants is younger than the average age of so-called evangelical Christians. That's a big change. What's happening? There is a whole group of folk in conservative churches, younger folk, who no longer feel comfortable with some of the social and political views these churches are known for, especially around gender, sexuality, what a woman can do. You visit the largest mega churches in this community and you look at their list of elders and you will not find a single woman. Some of these views are driving earnest Christians out of conservative churches. Where are they going to go? I hope we will know how to welcome those people. Are there other comments or questions?
You have a question? Oh.
Put me on the spot.
We're going to hear you whether you want to be heard or not. Huh? Why not?
Here is my scenario that why do you have to put the time around how do we get that quote unquote stigma out and just
I'm sorry, I could not hear very well.
oh okay. Ooh. Sorry. I said I like the when you mentioned about we should all our differences really shouldn't divide us.
Yeah,
But it looks like it is.
they do.
And how do you resolve issues like okay, the example I gave was we're going to on a march, Christian Solidarity March. Why does somebody have to come with a sign that I am so and so disciple? Why? How do you resolve the issue when somebody comes and they want to push this gender issue or even this, sometimes it's racial, but this homosexuality issue is something that's big too, that's dividing. How do we deal with such people who are so hell-bent, if I can use the word in church, on just pushing that thing to the forefront of every discussion?
Yeah, I think this is the great challenge, and this is why the dreams that Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone had for the unity of the church did not materialize. They underestimated how social and political differences in their era, slavery was huge as an issue, would divide the church. So I'm not assuming that this is easy or that it's going to happen overnight. But change does often happen in surprisingly fast ways. And I think we should be alert to possibilities. Meanwhile, I think we should be good at listening. And as we listen and we find ourselves really at odds, and the two issues you mentioned would be ones where I would suggest that we remember that when a person is very much against something, it's because they're trying to protect something. And so I think it's important to say, what are you trying to protect, right? You're really unhappy about this. I don't see it that way. Something's very important to you. Help me understand. I can remember a conversation from 40 years ago with a wonderful leading woman in our church. Sue and I had just married, and we were going to be a clergy couple. And we had a little workshop. I was the assistant dean at Bright, and Sue and I talked about how being a clergy couple was just wonderful. And after that session in Weatherly Hall at Bright Divinity School, a distinguished, very active woman leader of the disciples walked up to us and said, "But what if you have children? What will you do if you have children? Will you ever have children?" Well, what was she trying to protect? She was trying to protect what I think we all would like to protect. We want children, and we want children to be cared for. And the way in which that had been done in all of her life meant that it was a woman's task, right? And Sue and I hadn't given it a lot of thought. We have 3 children. They're now adults, and so I think of this conversation often. There was hesitance to move towards something which made a lot of sense to me. Why? Because there was something special being honored. Now, some of the things that are being special may not be honorable at all. I like being the big guy, right? Why? Why is that important? We heard a good sermon on that this morning. Why is that important? Why do the values of this world keep us from living the values of Jesus Christ?
I've got one for you.
Yeah.
I really loved what you said about there being kind of hierarchical stuff among the non-denominational, even though it's not out there.
Yeah.
And I've experienced that in my own family, in that one of our sons grew up disciple, very much disciple theology.
I know that son, yes. Go ahead.
Well, you may not, I may be talking about a different one.
Okay.
I don't know. But this one is as socially liberal as you can imagine. And he has been on the forefront of helping 2 of these non-denominational churches get started, and is very fired up about that.
Yeah.
And I'm happy about that as well.
Yeah.
But what I did not know until I kept thinking, how do these things get started? I mean, where's the money? You probably know more about that than I do, but what I know is there is tons of money now being in pots around the country for the initiating of these kinds of churches. And that's probably a good thing. I mean, at least the ones that he's been involved with don't set up a bunch of rules. I mean, everybody's welcome. They could both look exactly like a Disciples of Christ church if they just use that label.
Yeah.
So my question for you is, what do we have as a denomination in terms of financial assistance now to help groups like that get started?
Sure. We have the mechanisms. We would have to have the passion. And what you're describing is, I think, a part of this larger breakdown in what has been classical evangelicalism. That is, for the last 30 years, maybe the last 50 years, because a number of the things that have been important in those churches don't look so good right now. And you have all of these formerly evangelical ministers who are selling lots and lots of books to lots and lots of people, including disciples, telling us things that we grew up knowing. But they come from someone who was once upon a time a megachurch pastor of a very conservative church. So there is a shift in the character of American religion right now. And it's a shift in a direction that is closer to historic disciples of Christ than was the case even 10 years ago. passion, wanting to see it happen. And then the question would be, for us, is it about us finally, or is it about the church? How can we sink in with the church at large? How can we be part of something that is larger than who we are? There were ways that we worked at that in the 1950s and 60s. How are the ways that we work with that now? Stone and Campbell did not want to start a denomination. They wanted to start a movement. And I think we can still be that movement, but we do have some organizational expertise now. We do know some things about how to get things done that could help us be even more useful going forward.
Our church has been looking for a new minister for probably about a year and a half.
I know.
So my question to you is Bright producing more graduates, same, fewer than a few years ago? What's the situation there?
Currently, the answer would be fewer. And this should not surprise us. Using the statistics that are now a few years back, and I'm speaking without my notes, so beware, but I get it more or less right. More or less right. From 1989 to 2009 to 2018, roughly 10 years, the number of white disciples decreased by 49%. Decreased by 49%. The number of Hispanic disciples went up by 35%. The number of African American disciples went up by 20%. The percentage of Asian American disciples went up by 30-some%. So we are becoming a more diverse denomination than ever because Asians, African Americans, and Hispanic churches are growing at something like by 30% in the last decade and more. And people who look like me are disappearing at a phenomenal rate. I'm 15 years from the average age that a privileged white man dies. He's got a few more years on me. Who are the people who could speak to privileged white people in this country? Church is not popular among the largest single racial ethnic group in our society. I think I have more questions than I have answers. I also have faith. And I believe God is at work in the world and that God can use us even yet. And that by God's grace, we have been given some very special perspectives, practices, knowledge to be used for the whole.
We have time for another? I've got one. Of all of the things and aspects that are components to disciples' history and heritage, in your opinion, what is kind of the one aspect of disciples' heritage that you are most proud of? Mm-hmm. And then also, what component of disciples' heritage do you think would best equip us to respond to the world today?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. It's actually the question I sent to my disciples' history course over the weekend. They had to turn in a response to me by midnight because I said I wanted them to celebrate the Lord's Day appropriately. So I'll be able to tell you what our students think within 24 hours. you know, what am I think the commitment to Christian unity is hard to not to see as paramount. If church could find ways to reduce the increasing divisions in this nation and beyond, to have that as a goal, to understand that that's what we're supposed to be about. And I think we have tried to live this, and I think we need to continue trying to live this, to be the folk who will welcome other religious communities in all kinds of ways, open to listening, desiring to understand, wanting to see whatever can be done together. I think that's important. I also think that Alexander Campbell's understanding of what happens in communion, which I shared with you today, is pretty special, because I've learned it's not universal. I have learned two things about this. The Baptists that I know don't get it at all. It is something we do from time to time, and it's about affirming that we are a church. But they don't expect Jesus to be present in any way in the supper. They don't hear the voice of Jesus Christ speaking to them. For disciples, my language would be building upon Campbell, that we have an experience and a tradition of experiencing an encounter with Jesus Christ at the Lord's table, in which we become aware both of his death and his resurrection. And I think that's enormously rich, powerful. If I'm ever going to be a good and decent person, you have the offering at the, well, maybe not the right place. Yes, you have it at the right place. It will be after the Lord's Supper, when I am brought to who I am by the love of God made known in Jesus in his death, and the fact that despite all the world has done to end it, that Jesus Christ is risen and among us. So I've spent some time with Baptists, and I know they don't get it, though I'm trying hard to impact them person by person. Kathleen knows. The other group, though, that I've hung out with a lot lately is Roman Catholics. And guess what? Roman Catholics get it. They talk about the Lord's Supper in language that we would never use. But when you sit down with Catholics and talk about it, what do they tell you? In the Eucharist, we experience the crucified and risen Lord who loves us and loves the world. Isn't that amazing? Now, if I wasn't part of a disciples organization that asked me to sit down and talk with Catholics for 5 years in a row, I would not know this. But because of our institutional life, I know that what happens in a Roman Catholic Mass and what happened here today is not very different. And what it is rich. And no wonder they value the Eucharist, and no wonder we value the Lord's Supper. Guess what? It is the same thing. I think that's pretty special. I'm going to try to give it to every Baptist I can find.
A
Yes,
thing
sir.
I've always been proud of about Christian Church Disciples of Christ is that we are initiators. And I think you've named some of that already
Yeah.
in your connection to the Catholic reference there. But whatever you feel about us being in Afghanistan or coming out, not any kind of point I would make this morning, but when that crisis developed, I started getting emails from our immigration office at D.C., Sharon Ray,
Yeah.
inviting churches to be involved in the settlement of some of our allies that are
Yeah,
trying to get out.
yeah, right.
So I'll use that as an example of how I understand disciples to be initiators,
Yeah,
using structure to make a difference in the world.
yeah,
I was proud to get those.
yeah. We are a small outfit, right? But we have developed through the years some important offices that enable us to do some important things. And I'm hearing a lot about congregations that just really, warms my heart. I appreciated that part of the sermon this morning where you were asked, what thing for the world are you going to focus on? Last Sunday I was in Amarillo, First Christian Church in Amarillo. That church is probably not much larger than this one in membership. Maybe. I'm not sure what the numbers are. They have an enormous sanctuary. But it's not a huge congregation. They became aware during the pandemic that a lot of people in Amarillo didn't have shoes. They have now provided 1,500 pairs of shoes for people in their community. And then there's my own little congregation, University Christian Church in Fort Worth, has provided uniforms for students who go to public schools who cannot afford the uniforms in Fort Worth. 45,000 uniforms. Wow. We have mechanisms that enable us to share our resources to help our neighbors. What does it mean to be a Christian? What will the world think it means to be a Christian? They will know us, by our love. Friends, it's been great to be with you today. Appreciated the music, appreciated the sermon. Always grateful to be gathered with sisters and brothers to break the bread, drink from the cup. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. What if we finish with the word of prayer? God, we are grateful for your love that has come to us in so many new and fresh ways, even today, even at this table. As we move from this place, remind us that you go with us everywhere, and may we take your love to the people we meet. Amen.